Welcome to the Golden Pages podcast, brought to you by the School of Calligraphy and Ornamentation in Fujairah, UAE. I'm your host, Dr. Esther El-Hamel, and the school's managing director. This show will shine the light on arts from the Islamic lands, such as traditional manuscripts, illumination, gilding techniques, miniature, calligraphy, geometry, ornamentation, and bookmaking traditions. All of these subjects will also be taught in our school, so keep an eye on our website, socofujairah.ae. Welcome to episode number 4 of Golden Pages. In today's episode, you'll be hearing from Dr. Federica Gigante about the transmission of knowledge and the movement of things, people, and ideas between the Islamic world and Europe. Dr. Federica Gigante is a curator of the collection from the Islamic World in the History of Science Museum in Oxford University. Dr. Federica Gigante is interested in researching a range of subjects such as the collecting of Islamic artifacts in Europe, cross-culture exchange between the Islamic world and Europe, astronomical instruments from the Islamic world, history and circulation of technologies and decorative vocabulary across Central Asia and the Mediterranean. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Esther, for a very kind presentation.
Of course. And it's like I could have said so much more. There's like so many more like subjects areas that you're interested in and things that you're doing that I am very excited to talk to you about.
I'm very excited to talk to you today about it too.
So let's start from the beginning. How did your research interest develop and why Islamic art specifically and its collecting practices in Europe?
So I grew up in Italy with not that much exposure to Islamic art. But since I was a teenager, I've always been attracted by Islamic culture and the Islamic world. And I studied art history at university in Italy, and there weren't many teachings in Islamic art, so I did very, very little. And it came only when I started working for UNESCO as an intern in Paris at the headquarters. Arabic was one of the languages of the UN, and so they offered free courses. And I decided to enroll in Arabic. So that was my first experience really to the language. And I absolutely loved it. I don't know what happened. I fell in love with the language first, and then I wanted to explore anything that was connected with it, like culture, from art to history to food in a way. So it is through the language in a way that I got more and more interested. I never really managed to master it fluently, but I'm always fascinated and try to get every occasion to speak and interact with Arabic speakers. So when I then left Paris and went back to London to do my postgraduate studies, I thought that was my chance and decided to enroll at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies. There I read and studied Islamic art, and then I decided to pursue it with a doctorate in Islamic art. Why did I get interested in collecting? Well, probably because my background originally was more in European history and art. That's what I had done for my BA. I thought that a very interesting way for me to get into the study of Islamic art was to start looking at the interactions and what sort of Islamic artifacts had traveled to Europe. And at the beginning, I was interested in Italy in the specific, which is my home country. And that's when I started discovering how many people in the past collected objects coming from the Islamic world and how many of these things actually filled museums throughout Italy and no one knew about them. So very few people had got interested in them. So I literally find a treasure trove.
That is so interesting. And the fact that the language brought you to the art is like it's amazing because sometimes it's the other way around as well. Some people just look at the art and like, "Ooh, what is this? Like I want to do some more related to this art." Like a lot of my students who come, they first they don't know a lot about like the Islamic history, but then the art is their in. So it's interesting to hear that the language was your in. Did you learn a particular accent when you were learning Arabic, or was it the Fusha Arabic?
I've learned for
Very
and this
good.
has actually been one of the main obstacles in a way, because then I went back to SOAS, as I said, and there I took Arabic, and I've only ever done Fusha. As you know, it's very hard to communicate in Fusha. I spent a summer in Beirut, for example. I thought that was such a good idea to practice Arabic. That was not. Because apart from courses that I attended, people on the streets would just laugh at me. And then they would either reply in Amia, which I didn't really understand, so in the dialect, or they would reply in French, which defeated the whole point. So I'm getting to a stage where I think I probably should start tackling a dialect just to have fun and talk to people.
Yeah, that's like this is the thing with Arabic. Fusha is the standard Arabic that people like will have on the news, in some cartoons and stuff, but you wouldn't have it as a conversation, as you said. And Lebanon is a tricky place because they have French as like one of their main languages. So it's trying to like infuse Arabic, and I'm not sure what advice I could give you about dialects. It's
No.
like you need to choose one and just commit to that one.
That is the issue. Apparently, one really has to pick one and then go for it.
But you know, most people will understand an Egyptian dialect because of the TV.
That's exactly what I've been told multiple times, and probably what I'll settle for. I'm going to go to Egypt this summer, and perhaps that'll be my way into Egyptian dialect.
Perfect. And it's like, it's lovely dialect, so you will enjoy it, I'm sure of it. So, what is the research process for you? Like, when you see a subject that you like, when you were like looking for subjects to study, even for your PhD, how did you choose one? How did you start researching? Because sometimes research sounds like a really nice idea, but people in practice don't know how to like get into it, and especially with subjects like Islamic arts when it's like very vague and very vast.
It is so true. So the answer will be different when you're a student to when you start sort of becoming a researcher. It's a bit of a snowball effect. Once you started a project, so many new ideas come out of it, and so it's easier. The difficulty is when you, as you said, start to think about a PhD and have to pick a topic. And you might have some good and very vague ideas, such as I did. I wanted to study the interactions between the Islamic world and Italy, and what kind of things were imported in the early modern period. But that was it. I didn't know what else to do. That's when having the advice of someone more senior is always very useful and valuable. And indeed, it was what then became my PhD supervisor, Anna Contadini, who's professor at SOAS, who gave me one piece of advice: just go and find it. And at the beginning, I was very puzzled because, there wasn't many instructions. It's just one very broad direction that she gave me. And I remember I called my mother and said, I'm coming home. I'll be there in 2 days. And her first reaction was, "What, are you pregnant?" I still remember that.
That is like a very funny one. It's like, okay, this is the only reason I would come home.
Well, indeed, I was a bit surprised. I said, no, absolutely. But I need to search for some Islamic artifacts. And she was as puzzled as I was. She was just coming out of some cancer therapy. So it was a difficult moment, but I thought it was also the right moment to get her out of the house. So we got into a car, the two of us, and that was literally the first day she had ever left home after, the cures and the operation. And we traveled throughout northern Italy. We literally drew a sort of very sketchy map and found every tiny museum that we could find. The idea was really to find the small ones, the ones maybe people hadn't paid attention to, and stopped and got in and took photos. And it was really fascinating because we found so many things, also unexpected things, such as a collection of Chinese art in the middle of the countryside, assembled by some Franciscan friars because of their missions in China throughout the years. That wasn't what I was looking for, but it was interesting to find. And there I selected a series of objects that I found in 3 particular museums in northern Italy, in Bologna, Padua, and Modena. And then as things go, there were too many. And so when I started researching them, I only focused on one particular collection in Bologna. And that was quite enough to keep me busy for 3 years. And that was just like, as I said, a snowball effect, because I wanted to find out who had imported these objects, realized there was one single person behind, got to his archive or his letters. He was a member of the Medici family, so he grew up in Florence in the 17th century, and that was so interesting and fascinating. And then opened up so many other sort of directions, such as his connections with the port of Livorno. In English, you say Leghorn. I've never understood quite why, but that was the Medici free port, basically one of the main contacts with the Islamic world at the time, which also hosted a colony of enslaved Muslims. This was the time in which there was so much pirating and corsairing going on in the Mediterranean. And so prisoners were being made at both sides of the Mediterranean, Christians in usually North Africa, and North Africans, or so-called Turks, in inverted commas, because they were all labeled as Turks in Italy.
Wow, that's like such a journey, like especially getting in the car, going to these small places, and like finding what you were looking for. And this is such a good lesson as well. It's like if you want to find something, you need to just go for it as the first step.
Oh, yes. So I then ended up working in museums, and in a way, that's probably how I did it, because I started to work with collections away in museums. And I'm such a practical, in a way, tactile person. I'm really interested in finding things. I guess I wanted to be an archaeologist when I was a child, so I still have that sense of wanting to hold the objects in my hands, which is why I'm attracted to museums, and especially, well, in Oxford. The advantage is that you're both an academic, because it's a university, and you have the collection to take care of. But yes, the advice very often is just go and look for things. So little has actually been digitalized or put online. There are very few collections that have the entire range visible for you to search through an engine. And also, having worked on the other side, on the museum side, a simple, banal consideration such as what keywords are you using to look for something? You might just miss so much, so just go and look for it.
That is such great advice. And as you said, digitization like is a great thing, but a lot of things are not yet available. Like when I look for patterns to teach, this is like one of the most challenging things. Like I need to go to these locations to see the original patterns, because sometimes you even get pictures of these same patterns but not in the same orientation that you could actually use it to teach. So it's like a close up, like really artsy from like the ceiling. And you're like, no, 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 I just want a square of that pattern. So I completely understand that. And the fact that you found it from the Medici family. So my experience and knowledge of them is very limited to the Netflix series.
A very good port of entry.
And it was so fascinating, like just knowing a little bit more about their life. So it's like hearing their name, I'm like super excited. I'm like, ooh.
So in a way, in my PhD is the following series, because I worked on a bit of a later period, the 17th century. I think the series covers largely the sort of 15th and early 16th century. And yes, so perhaps they'll script me for
I think you should
follow
contact
up.
Netflix. It's
Why
like
not? Yeah.
you need season. I think they did like 2 or 3 seasons. I can't remember, but it was amazing. So I would watch more of it for sure. So you touched on working at a museum from your research. So how did your research really lead you to becoming a curator? Because you're not just working in the museum, like under the books and researching, you're also a curator.
Well, yes, as I said, the fascination with objects and my familiarity, I guess, because of my PhD, I ended up having really to do a lot of work with the collection I had discovered. So, in a way, it prepared me for what came after. Um, and also, as I said, I've been quite lucky because I worked for a couple of years at the Ashmolean Museum, also at the University of Oxford, and then for more than 3 years at the History of Science Museum, which is also part of the University of Oxford. And there you really get the best of both worlds because you are an academic. So my contract is part research, which means I have all the flexibility and time to also continue with my own research at the same time as researching the collection. And there is nothing better than when the two meet together and you can actually use things you're doing for more sort of mundane cataloging for your own article and to make an argument on something in particular. One of the things, for example, I've been focusing on in the last months has been the cataloging of the collection. And that is why I have been so deep into the idea of how you put information online, for example. And that's been extremely fascinating. I've realized how little, for example, has been done on Islamic scientific instruments, which is what I'm focusing at the moment, and how much there is still to do, to find out, to discover, and to tell people.
So I'm very interested in knowing more about the online aspect of you putting this information out there for people. So what have you found out in terms of like the keywords? Like, what are your thoughts on this? I need to know more.
Well, so there are many difficulties actually that we have encountered. Some seem banal, but actually they're not at all, such as keywords. For example, we have objects that were made in what is nowadays Morocco. However, very often we do know where they were made, say Fez or Marrakesh, as an example. These have been entered in the database as Fez or Marrakesh. Now, so when you search for Morocco, they will not come up because of the way, the database is structured. You can overcome this by creating a so-called thesaurus, whereby every term is connected to another one. But then you get into a different problem. That is, for example, if you're searching for the term Mamluk, then it is a dynasty, but many people just will think in terms of production of artifacts according to the people who made them in the past. At that point, this will not appear in the thesaurus. So what I've been thinking about is maybe you put tags associated with particular objects. And that's why I was saying earlier, very often, if you're a student, you just go on a database and you search for a Mamluk astrolabe and nothing comes up. That doesn't tell you that it's not there. It just tells you that your research did not hit the right keywords. And this is one issue. The other is, of course, that we tend to use a type of database that was never really meant for these objects. My feeling and understanding is that modern museums use a series, there are mainly 2 or 3, that were always in origin built for paintings and Western art. So when you try to actually catalog a piece of Islamic art inside these fields, you find that it doesn't fit. You need to adjust and you need to omit so much. And yes, that's one of the difficulties. So perhaps we're thinking just putting things online on a free text, can be a way around it, but that's not a structured database. So there are so many issues that haven't really been fully solved.
That is so difficult when you're thinking about it because, as you said, there are so many aspects that you could consider, like the date, the geography, the people who actually made it, the dynasty. And sometimes it's like geography and dynasty, they kind of clash together. And you're like, when did they really finish? Was it like 1501 or 1502? And that makes a difference.
And the majority of these objects are actually signed and dated, but they're dated to the Hijra. And the database doesn't do a Hijri calendar. It does a Gregorian calendar, so you have to convert, which is good. But if someone searches for the actual date, so you insert 625 because that's what the actual object says, well, she will not hit the right result in the date field. It might, if you were to put it in the transcription field, because the date is transcribed, but it will not give you a correct result in the date field. So again, it's a bit more fiddly than one would imagine and expect.
Exactly. And this is why it's really important to go look for objects yourself.
Oh, absolutely.
More than just like the online collection. I feel like the online collections are a great starting point if you are like not able to travel. But the second you have the opportunity, traveling opens up true doors in research.
Yes. The other difficulty to that is very often it is difficult to have the doors opened in certain countries, especially, or when one doesn't know the people inside certain organizations. But it's always, always, always worth a try, and it's just such fun.
And research is like a whole new world, especially if like artists are listening to the podcast and their main practice is the practical art. And then getting to that research side to know more about the art, it's like you're opening like a new box of possibilities. You also mentioned scientific objects. So why have they not been studied much before?
With regard to scientific objects, you have an added difficulty. Not only do you need to know about Islam, Islamic art, but also about science. And some of these instruments do require, well, not certainly a doctorate in astrophysics, but some understanding of the way they were created, the maths behind and the geometry. And as a consequence, in order to catalogue them and be able to say what certain markings on them are meant to represent, you need to have that knowledge. And when I go into the museum, I myself didn't. So it was really a learning curve. I had the opportunity to engage with what is one of the world's largest and probably the world's finest collection of Islamic scientific instruments. And so that was just a treat because I learned by practicing, by, in a way, getting things wrong. In a way, the lockdown had the lucky side effect of allowing me to be alone with the objects in the museum for a very long time and try them. Very often is really what I had to resort to doing. Just try and see whether it works, whether the calculation you are meant to carry out with that object actually gives you the right results. And it's fascinating because, yes, very often it was absolutely spot on.
That's amazing. And it's like a lot of the times the science in the Islamic world is overlooked, or they're like, there's like this weird thing, like Muslims keep saying, oh, we had this amazing scientific thing that happened in the past. And then sometimes in Western society it's like, no, Muslims never had that science knowledge. And then when you see the evidence, when you look at the objects and the instruments, and you're like, oh my God, they were like very advanced. Like with my friend and I, Samira, Mayan, and May, when we went to Uzbekistan, and we went to Ulugh observatory.
Samarkand.
Yes, and it was so fascinating. He predicted almost exactly the year, like minus a day. He was off by like half a day, not even a full
Absolutely.
day. And you're like, oh my God, this is like mind blowing. This information hasn't even come to Europe
No,
till like later.
it's true, actually. That is fascinating and, in a way, sad story because Ulubei's tables, charts did reach Europe so long after, once they were in a way redundant, because in Europe they had discovered the telescope and done different calculations. But at the time he made them, well, it was like the most accurate sort of astronomical information you could have.
That's so cool. But we'll go back into the curation aspect. So you're surrounded by a lot of amazing objects and manuscripts and all these possible things that could be curated into an exhibition. How does the selection process happen? Like how do you choose the subject of exhibition or the objects that you're going to display?
Often the choice for an exhibition comes from having thought about an idea for a very long time, proposing it. But it is also true that it depends on other things that are happening around. Sometimes this, coincides with a particular anniversary, whereby it makes sense to focus on one aspect rather than another. From the idea stage to putting it together, there's really a very big step. The selection of objects is really a process of compromise, because one might have in mind what the best items to illustrate one's point would be, but then there's the practicality of needing money to get them shipped to you. There's so many costs involved: insurance, transport, so-called couriering, and this is only one aspect. The other one is, would the museum you are asking be keen to lend it to you? Very often there are clashes such as, well, no, we don't want to part from this item. No, we've already promised it to someone else. No, this is not actually a key priority. Your venue is not, it doesn't have the visibility or the setting we'd like to. So there are so many considerations to be made. And this, in a way, shapes also the themes you're going to explain, because at a certain point, if you don't have the items to talk about something in particular, you're obliged to shift slightly.
That is so true. And it's like when you visit an exhibition, you don't think about these things. You just think of like, oh, this is interestingly displayed. Oh, what a nice object. Or just like read the information. But it's nice to know like more about the ins of how these things are just like decided as well. So can you tell us it doesn't have to be just the one, or multiple favorite objects in collections or exhibitions that you previously curated?
There is one in particular that I was so thrilled about handling, and this was an exhibition I curated at the History of Science Museum called, I think it's called Precious and Rare Islamic Metalwork from the Courtauld. Yeah, at least that would be good to get it right. So yes, there is one object that I was so thrilled about handling, and this was part of an exhibition I curated in 2020 at the History of Science Museum called Precious and Rare Islamic Metalwork from the Courtauld. And the object I'm talking about is the so-called Courtauld Bag, clearly because it comes from the Courtauld collection. And this is the only surviving inlaid metalwork handbag from sort of Mongol times. And it's just one of the most extraordinary pieces of art. I don't know if you've ever seen it and had the chance to admire it. It's literally a lady's handbag from Ilkhanid, Iran. And it is such a rare survival because such artifacts would probably have been sort of going out of fashion very quickly. When we're talking about metal, things tend to be remelted, so it is rare to find such items belonging to, to a particular lady of the court. And there is something about it. It's not only its beauty, but it's also how relatable it is. It's a handbag, and it's it's capacious enough to hold, your lipstick, your glasses, your phone nowadays. And you can really, in a way, relate to whoever was the person who carried it around. Most likely would have been a servant. We have manuscript illuminations that show ladies in waiting going about the court and carrying these handbags. But that was by far one of the most exciting objects I had to handle and put my hands on.
That sounds amazing. It's like I kind of need that handbag now. It's like I haven't even seen it, but I need it in my life.
And, when one really thinks about it a bit more, because my first question was, why would you need a metal handbag? And I was at the time working with some community volunteers who were helping with the exhibition. These are part of a project called Multaqa, which means meeting point in Arabic. And the museum would like to be literally a meeting point between different cultures and start discussions through objects. And this was one such example where people coming from the Islamic world and, who had experience of Central Asian countries said, well, actually, you probably need metal if you don't want insects to go, around your things. My grandmother had a metal casket where she kept things, and it was an aside to it, and I had never really thought about trying to visualize why something was needed in that particular context, in that particular part of the world.
That is so interesting. And you're also not fascinated only by this, but you do like metalwork in general.
Yeah.
So, can you tell us more about the world of Islamic metalworks and why it fascinates you so much?
Perhaps because it is so very different from anything that I was familiar with and that we produced in Europe. And then, of course, there's the different story of how many imitations there were in Europe in Renaissance and early modern times. What really attracted me, well, in a way I could say because they're shiny and so pretty and beautiful, but it's not actually that untrue. Islamic metalwork, especially the type that has survived, tends to be inlaid metalwork. That means it's usually a brass or bronze base or a copper alloy in general, so not particularly precious metal, inlaid with silver or gold. It's a technique where you will create a sort of indentation, a recess for the precious metal to be inserted, and then pin it in place with the sides of your indentation. And that can create calligraphy, inscriptions, imagery. It basically gives you a surface where you can depict and write and be so free in a way that metalwork was not really ever been used beforehand. Of course, there is so much that has survived nowadays, also because of a survival history. And that's something I always try to keep in mind and tell people. What we have today doesn't necessarily mirror what was available at the time. Inlaid metalwork is a mixture of metals, which means it makes it quite tricky to melt down if you want to just salvage the various metals, because the melting points of the various metals involved is very, very close. You would need to unpick it entirely by hand. It's probably time consuming, not worth it. So they tend to survive a lot more. Base metal would always have been repurposed for something like a cooking pot, perhaps, while precious metal, as you can imagine, is actually one of the rarest type of metals to find because of its intrinsic quality. You'd immediately, at the first moment of crisis, melt it to use it for something else.
That is such a good point. And it's interesting what you said about what we have now is not necessarily a reflection of what it was. Like, because sometimes it feels like, oh, we know exactly what they've done. We know how they lived. We know this. But in reality, we actually don't know any of these details. We have like a glimpse into their world, but it could be completely different. Like what we're telling, the narrative that we're telling ourselves, it could be, the opposite of their reality back then. And it's an interesting thing to keep imagining and thinking about, for sure.
Yes, and that's when manuscript paintings come into being quite useful, because not only of the details that a medium such as paper can allow, but the colors, for example. So you can get a bit more of a glimpse into people's lives. And very often, especially when one works on ephemeral items such as textiles, one really has to rely on paintings and visual evidence, because organic material tends to deteriorate, and so would handbags in a way.
I'm glad you mentioned manuscripts because this is exactly what I was going to ask you next. So, you're also interested in manuscripts, and then you wrote an interesting article recently about the rediscovered Islamic manuscripts of the Cosby Museum. Hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, in the University Library of Bologna.
Bologna.
Bologna. I was very close. So, could you tell us a little bit about these manuscripts and if they impacted the Italian visual culture at all?
Yes, absolutely. That was quite a interesting, thrilling piece of research I did, because I felt like I was being a sort of detective going to unearth these manuscripts. These were part of the collection I did my PhD on. And although in the museum, the famous museum I had bumped into during my first trip with my mum, there were many items. The majority were metalwork and ceramic. I knew through his catalogues, correspondence, and basically the written material that he possessed manuscripts. He described them, and I could see it in letters that he wrote to his patrons in the Medici. But they were nowhere to be found, and I was convinced that they must have been somewhere. So it started with just the assumption that they must exist. And so then I started to follow them in two directions. On the one hand, from the 17th century sources that I had and what they said these manuscripts looked like. On the other hand, I assumed they would have ended up in the library, which is also the location where part of the collection passed in the 18th century. So I had some clues, and basically I did a sort of double reconstruction going backward. I selected a group of manuscripts in the library through the catalogues, which could potentially have been the right ones, and followed them backward through the catalogues. And what I found was that there was a small group of them that had always been kept together. They had classification marks very near, close to each other, like contiguous, that they disappeared from the main catalogue in the 19th century. Then they reappeared in a separate catalogue in the 18th century. So these were manuscript catalogues of the library. Realized they had been put in a particular cabinet, and basically the two sides of the story just managed to touch. And they touched when I found, and I was very lucky, a document in an archive which basically said this group of manuscripts that had belonged to the Cosby Museum were being transferred to the library on this particular day with the list. And I was like, so I could go and find them and look at them and handle them for the first time. And I knew by then they were really his manuscripts. What is even more fascinating is that one of them, and it's a beautiful muraqqa from Iran, the calligraphy is actually late Timurid, but it was put together and assembled in Safavid times with plenty of illuminations. It has a writing at the back which says it was from the Grand Duke of Tuscany, and is exactly what my letters and other sources told me that that one particular book must have been a gift from the Medici to the collector. And there it was, written on the very book.
That is so amazing. It's like how all the dots connected to bring you there. Can you describe some of the visuals that you saw in the manuscript? It's like I want to imagine it with you.
Yes, absolutely. So this one particular manuscript is certainly the most visually pleasing of all. It is a calligraphic album, and it features some calligraphy in the middle with some decorative features, but what is really the most striking part of it is all the margins are illuminated with gold, and they have some sort of hunting scenes and animals. Animals and flowers is what appears the most. You find deer, ducks, and any other sort of birds in flowers, and because they've been painted in gold, you often require to move the manuscript to get into breaking light and have it shine at you. And I find it so such a sort of hands-on tactile experience to do that. We often see these things, talking and going back to digitalization, as something flat on a screen, but the way you can interact with it changes so much according to how you move it around. The light is caught in a completely different way and shines and comes across. Sometimes you don't see details until you move it around.
And I love that about painting with gold. Like, it's such a privilege because you have these impacts and how it interacts with like the light. It's just so beautiful. You're like, oh my God, it's like even imitation gold won't do that. Like, the imitation gold is like shiny all the time. But with real, genuine gold, it's just, it flickers, it interacts, it tells you a completely different story. So I'm glad you found that as well.
And it's also a reminder of the type of experience for the viewers of these objects. As I said, we now see them on the screen of our computers, but especially in the Western world, we're more used to seeing visual images, very static, on a wall, in a frame, painting forms. But these paintings require a completely different level of engagement, that of discovering when you literally turn the page and you discover a particular image, the way you would have had to go around the book and interact. The calligraphy in this particular case is sideways, so you'd have to physically turn the book around to enjoy, and sometimes the paintings round follow their direction or they don't. So it really requires a lot of manipulation in a way.
That sounds so amazing. Lastly, can you tell us about some artistic techniques and materials that traveled across Asia to Europe and how these informed some of the local artistic production? I know it's like a really big question, but you can maybe choose one of the techniques and tell us a little bit more about it.
One very good example is that of a luster painting on ceramic. Luster painting was an Islamic invention. It is an extraordinary technique that tends to imitate gold and the shine of gold, as you were talking about it, on ceramic vessels. And it's not as easy as painting in gold on ceramic, because once you put it in a kiln, that there would be a bit of a problem there. So in Abbasid times, artisans had come up with this technique of double firing ceramics, whereby once you have your fully formed vessel and you have put it in your kiln and it's basically intact and perfect and could be used as it is, you apply a copper-based paint and you fire it a second time in what is called a reduction environment. So basically you just take the oxygen off, and that creates and triggers a chemical reaction and turns that copper into a film that really has the appearance of gold and the shine of gold. And that was something that was imitated, or they tried to imitate in Europe for centuries because of the splendor of these ceramics. Spain, Islamic Spain, was and then became one of the main centers of the production of lusterware, luster vessels. And that's also a very interesting moment of interaction, because you can see, for example, in Italy, imitations of this luster, but because they didn't know the technique initially, they would only use it, they would only paint vessels trying to get pigments to replicate it, so some sort of yellowish red, and you can see today items and vessels that look very similar in shape and form and decoration, but the technique isn't quite there. This is something that will be cracked in time, and it's quite interesting going back to what we were saying earlier about the Medici. Trying to get hold of techniques such as theirs, that of porcelain, for example, was one of the obsessions of the Medici at a certain time, and they even built a laboratory to just focus on trying to find these different techniques. It will be eventually discovered and also will become a decorative technique that you find in Italian ceramics from a certain period onward.
This is so interesting how things travel and impact each other. And it's like, I feel like it's a missed opportunity sometimes when they are very separately studied. And they're like, oh, this is what happened in Europe. This is what happened in the Islamic world. But there is a relationship that has been there, and it's been festering for like centuries. And it's nice to shine the light on it because it shows, collaboration. It shows inspiration. It's like, why are we kind of separating ourselves from that possible research? So it's really fascinating talking to you about this. So if people would like to read more of your research, how can they access it and find you?
I guess they could access my academia.edu page, where I, if I can, and they're free of copyright, try to upload papers and articles I've written.
So you also have your Twitter account where people can find you?
Yes, if they'd like to find me, my Twitter name is @Federica_GIG.
Perfect. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Ezra. That was really nice to talk to you.
Thanks. You are listening to Golden Pages with me, Dr. Esra Al-Hamal, brought to you by the School of Calligraphy and Ornamentation in Fujairah, UAE. I hope you enjoyed this episode and found it enriching. If you know anyone that would like it, please share it with them. For more information on the School of Calligraphy and Ornamentation, please visit our website, socofujairah.ae, and sign up to our newsletter to stay in the loop.